remember the very, very important distinction that often still gets confused between pedophilia and child molestation. Just because we can't change the person's sexual interests doesn't mean that we can't help them change their behavior. So when somebody says, oh, if you can't treat it, you can't do anything, no, that's not what this implies. It implies that I need to do things to help the person. I need to treat the situation the person's in and the life they have. That often, necessarily, if I can't change the brain, I have to help them live with it. I have to help them acknowledge it and deal with it. Sometimes that's a matter of sex drive reducing meds to take the edge off. For some people, that's a matter of keeping themselves out of harm's way. But the question, can we treat it, we've now slipped between, just because we don't think at this point, the brain data don't suggest that we can change pedophilia, doesn't mean that it can't change a person's propensity to offend, which is actually what we're after. Is it in the genes? Although we don't really have time to talk about it today, there's really only been one genetic study. Now, doing genetic studies requires absolutely enormous samples. The only thing with more data points than the brain is DNA. And so it takes very, very large samples in order to run those studies. And you also need the families and their DNA. That's not going to happen. A lot of the families have, of course, by then dissociated from the offender. Certainly, they're very often their own children, especially for incest offenders. So there hasn't been a lot of work on that. There's been one study that showed that it did seem to run in families. That doesn't necessarily mean it's genetic, but there was something going on that seems to run in families. An example of something that's non-genetic would be, for example, in a family that's very poor. They share an environment from generation to generation, in addition to sharing the genes.